Hello, I'm Stuart Bowes, and you're watching or listening to the Net Hero podcast. This is a podcast for you if you care about what we're doing to the planet. You don't have to be an eco-warrior. We believe business is the solution to making things better. But we're for people who want to make that difference by either cutting their emissions or coming up with ideas that can help us do things a bit better. We've featured politicians, academics, lots and lots of business people, entrepreneurs, inventors, and of course people who are just interested in doing the right thing. So sit back, listen and enjoy, and make sure you subscribe to the podcast. Please share it with your friends and colleagues, and you can always check out our two websites that cover all of this, Energy Live News and FutureNetZero.com. This podcast is purely editorial, so sit back and enjoy this week's episode. Crap! I know that's what most of you think this podcast is. How dare you? But in reality, waste, crap, whatever you want to call it, is part of what we've done since we've been on the planet Earth. Whether it's the old Stone Age men leaving bits of crap that we now find and they're amazing artifacts. I wonder if this will happen in the future. People have packets of crisps and go, wow, this is amazing what these people did. But the real truth is, for us to get to net zero, one of the things that we never really deal with enough is our waste problem. Now, Labour has pushed the button on net zero in a big way since they've come in. And it's a lot about generation. It's a lot about clean power. But the thing they haven't looked at enough, in my view, and if you talk to people in the sector, is waste. And whatever we do, it doesn't matter if it's clean power or not, we will create a footprint of waste. Think of the things that you and I have, whether it's from our newspapers, if you still read them, our food packaging, our computers. What happens? How many of you have got old chargers like I have sitting there? Probably go to landfill. There's a lot of controversy about waste. People say that, you spend all this time sifting it and then what happens, it just gets burned. Well, what's the truth about waste and its role in net zero? Well, that's what I'm going to discuss today. And I've got a man with a PhD in crap. Is that right, Adam?
True. Yeah. Apologies now.
A PhD in waste and all of that. Adam Reed from Suez. Hello, how are you?
I'm very well. Thanks for the invitation. I think I'm on the right podcast by the sounds of it.
You are on the right podcast. That's exactly it. Before we go into kind of the waste thing, you've been in it in a long time. Is it fair to say that it's one of those things that, and people say this to heat as well, we sort of know it, but we ignore it, right? I certainly remember going to Australia in 2000, and the first time I'd ever seen a bin in a park that was, waste and then recycle, and I'd never seen that in the UK. And I grew up, I'm in my 50s, I didn't throw things on the floor, but there wasn't really a big culture around waste, and bin men, you just tucked everything in. A lot of that's changed over the last kind of 10, 15 years, but there's also been a backlash. People see the pictures of waste floating down and being dumped in Southeast Asia and just being burnt and all of that. So before we go into kind of what we're going to talk about, where we are about waste and net zero, is it something that you think industry as a whole hasn't looked at sufficiently enough until recent times?
I think it's a fair challenge. I think historically waste, it was leftovers, it was discards, it was residue, and if you could get rid of it cheaply, then you didn't really have to worry about it. And I think what's happened is, from the 70s onwards, we started to recognise that, uncontrolled landfills weren't good for the environment. Then we learnt about, climate change and carbon emissions. Then recycling started to become a bit of a thing. And, one of my, the huge influences on my career were the Wombles growing up in Wimbledon in the 1970s. So, I couldn't be anything but an expert litter picker. And I think when you started to see more of the evidence, as somebody that's got a geography background, you started to realise that there was strong science that maybe the cheap and cheerful disposal methods of the past weren't really going to be a long-term solution to one planet. Then you started to go, well, how do we handle this? What do we need to do differently? And then you recognise that there's more cost. And I think that's why industry is interested over the last 10 years, is because handling waste, or shall we say resources, better takes a bit of time and effort. And that can be a cost implication or just a time implication or a staff implication. And therefore it's becoming more of a boardroom discussion point because nobody wants to be seen to be a Luddite or a polluter. And therefore we're having to rethink exactly what our relationship with stuff is.
It's a funny thing, isn't it? Because, I think we're probably about the same age group because I certainly remember the Wombles. When I was growing up, it was called pollution, right? And that was a thing that really, and we saw it, whether it was acid rain or kind of, the things that people now see, which is the plastic in rivers. I mean, God, I grew up in East London where people were dumping shopping trolleys in canals and things like that. And then this is for the younger generation, that's kind of gone. They all talk about climate change. And I've always had a problem with the term climate change anyway, because I think it was made up by the Republicans as a kind of way to get away from kind of the real thing about what was going on. They didn't like the term global warming. But if you talk about climate change, you kind of think weather, you think all of that. But waste, pollution. We had a podcast about a year and a half ago where a couple from Mumbai just saw all the dump on the beach and all they did is collect all the waste. And what a transformation that did. Now, whether that affected the local climate or whatever, it's a very obvious thing, isn't it? If you see waste in a river and then that river gets cleaned, wow, we can see it. Do you think, before we explore this more, we've lost a bit of that disconnection because the phrasing is all climate change, climate change, climate change. And it's not what we grew up with pollution.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think pollution meant something to everybody.
Yes.
Whether it was polluting watercourses or the land or the air, I think climate change is a little bit of a wishy-washy commentary. It kind of hides the facts, and I think it doesn't localize it in a way that many people would recognize from historical pollution issues. And I think, let's be honest, waste management has always been out of sight, out of mind. Yeah. The dustman, of old would, or the Wombles, if you prefer, would suddenly, this stuff would disappear from your front garden, and you would have no idea where it went or what happened to it. But that's okay because we looked after it. And I think society, and I mean business and people, have kind of had a bit of a disconnect with the realities of their decisions. And I think modern resource management, modern environmental protection is kind of about reintroducing public and societal responsibility. And that can be quite difficult to go, so you mean buying stuff is a problem? Or choosing not to put it in the right bin is a problem, when actually that's not a problem on your doorstep. No. The impact isn't immediate. It's a year away. It's 1,000 miles away. And therefore it's not really a problem at all, is it? I think the disconnect is an obvious issue.
And I suppose the thing is, for most of us, we don't see it like you just said. So it gets collected in your green bin, blue bin, purple bin, whatever colour bin you got these days. In the old days, it was just a silver trash can thing. And then it goes off. And we hear that some of it gets burnt. We hear some of it gets recycled. We hear some of it goes into landfill, but we don't really see it unless you live near it and you can smell it. Again, all of these things, they probably affect the perception of people in business as well. Because, I remember we'd have skips outside the BBC where I worked and people would just dump stuff. You never thought about it. Do you think that has also played a role in why it's not been seen as that important until now, when we've started to get this wider connection?
I think you're definitely onto something in that kind of disconnect, and I think because it was cheap. I mean, it was never a priority because you could get a skip for under 50 quid, and it would disappear quite happily. All your bins would be collected every week without fail.
But we never asked the question, did we? We didn't say, where's it going?
We trusted the system. And I think it's only when you get the media reports about
fly tipping,
recyclables ending up on a beach in Indonesia, or a fly tip round the corner suddenly becoming something you can see from space, that you start to go, oh, hang about, maybe we've been trusting the wrong thing. And people start to ask the right questions then, which is where. So some of my customers, some of the households in, say, Somerset, for example, are very interested in where does our recyclable material go. And so the county council, the municipality, have made it very clear that to be their partner on a long-term resource management contract, you have to be able to guarantee that material is going round in the UK economy, and they need to know which plants, which facilities are utilising those materials. I like that type of reconnection at a geographical level. Not all that material will stay in Somerset. That's almost impossible. But a large chunk of it is being processed locally, and I think that's very important to the ultimate customer, which is, my mum.
Yeah, of course. I don't know if you've got this to your hand, but I've got some outdated figures here about how much waste we generated. I think
Hmm.
there's about 200 million tons of waste. That says 2020, but it must be more than that. But it'd fallen because of COVID. But I
Yes.
mean, we produce a shed load of it, right? And I think it's something like there was some stat. It's like kind of, each of us has produces like a ton or more of rubbish, right? So if you look at this, there's another element of it which is quite startling. We have listeners from around the world, particularly in India. We have quite a lot of listeners. You see dumps there and you see waste very visually, right? It's there in front of you. You see a polluted river, you see a dump where kids are going there. Because we don't see it so much, we actually produce more waste per capita than these people in Africa and developing nations. But we don't see it. We go, well, actually, it's all very clean here. Again, this is a bit of a trick, isn't it? Of kind of the smugness that we go, oh, we don't want to go there. It really smells. But actually, you're producing more waste and we don't see it because we just go, oh, it's nicely dealt with.
Yeah, I think the disconnect you identify is one that I think as an industry we're busy trying to readdress, which is unfortunately people don't think about what they consume. So we
No,
only waste a lot of material because we buy a lot more material than almost
absolutely.
anybody.
Absolutely.
Maybe the Americans can buy a little bit more.
Yeah, yeah, they're ahead of us. But
But
yeah,
we've learnt well. I mean, and the on the go culture that is so very
mm,
British isn't British. It's American in history. And yet, if you look at what happens in the streets of Paris or in the streets of Budapest or Barcelona, they've got cafe culture just like we've got.
yes.
But actually, we've everything we do is on the go, which is so much more American than it is European. So when you compare us and go, you're really polluting. Yes, we're very consuming, and our waste management practices are actually better than the US. Our performance is better than the US, but it's not as good as some of our Scandinavian partners, and that's because their system is perhaps a little bit better designed for the users of the system, i.e., my mum or business at large, and they've got a bit more segregation. They've got a bit of recognition that there's value in some of those materials. So they've designed a system which is about valuing and keeping value, where we've had a system that was always out of sight, out of mind, because that made it easier for life to go on.
You said raise a very interesting point because we do have a lot of this, you know, takeaway, right? Everyone got takeaway, and I remember, you see it now. There's been a change, but until recently, you could get your McDonald's and other burger things in those polystyrene things. You go to a kebab shop, which I've frequented many in my day, and plastic fork in a polystyrene box, and they're slightly changing, but.
They are.
All of that thing of coffee cups, things on the go, all of that, that's all contributed to this. And yet, you and I probably grew up which is funny, it's coming back. You'd
Deposit
finish your
return.
bottle, yeah, but deposit return, you finish your bottle and you'd go to the sweet shop and you'd get 2p or 5p back. Science has played a role in this as well, hasn't it? Because we've had this consumable culture, and then people say, "Oh, it's biodegradable plastic." You don't think too bad about it. So, in another way, it has the waste industry in itself created this thing where you don't worry so much in the way we used to. I remember going shopping and it was all paper bags. Then it went to plastic bags. Now we're going back to paper bags. It's hilarious, but the idea was the paper bag was oh, it just gets ripped, it gets wet, and all of those things. And these are all old technologies. But we sort of made our lives easier, didn't we? Everything was wrapped in cellophane.
It was all about convenience,
Yeah.
and I get that because life became busy and we became commuters and we were
Yes.
transients,
Yeah.
and everything became about the 5 minutes you could save by drinking on the go between meetings. I get all that, but actually it's not the waste industry that's driven that. It's retailers and brands who are selling goods, and as the public have changed. And not only the public, I mean, sitting in an office, how many people turn up with lots of takeaway cups of coffee
Yeah.
for a team meeting when we've got a kettle in the office?
Exactly.
We're all hijacked by.
Way old school here.
Hey, look at that! Look, that's my recycle, reusable mug. Nice piece of aluminium,
Lovely.
hundreds and hundreds of uses. But it's easy to get caught up in the
It
moment,
is. It
and I
is.
get it. I really do. I commute a lot, and I feel it. My job, the job of the waste industry, is to kind of react to what's happening in society and go, either can we work with the brands
Yes.
to go, look, we understand coffee cups are going to be here forever. So rather than fight you over them and complain that they contaminate lots of my recycling streams and end up in the litter and are an eyesore,
Yeah, they're all bits, aren't they? Yeah.
how could we change your production of coffee cups slightly to make them more recyclable? So
Sorry to interrupt you there, Adam, but is that a job for you as the waste industry? Because or the manufacturer, because it's really difficult because they'll manufacture something that someone wants and they say, right, we want it so it doesn't get wet, it holds the heat and all of these things, which involves thin layers of plastic we've heard about. I've heard so many stories about this stuff. And it's not actually a paper cup, it's a lot of plastic in a paper cup. Whereas then you go and try and recycle the thing and you can't. So is that happening now? People like you in the waste industry are having the conversations with the manufacturers at the point of source.
I can guarantee it's happening now. I've been at Suez 7 years, and for much of that 7 years, I've spent as much time inside the R&D and production sites of the major brands operating in the UK. People that are producing crisp packets, people that are producing fizzy drinks.
Yeah,
you know who I'm talking about.
Yeah,
I've sat inside their their procurement teams, their sustainability teams, their branding teams, and they've gone to me, if we switch to an algal material, if we switch to mushroom, if we go starch, if we do this, if we take the lid off, what would happen to this material on the street or at your recycling plant or in the back of your lorry? And that's a conversation that I'm absolutely over the moon to be having, because it's a recognition that that system goes before the consumer and after the consumer, and i.e. I'm going to handle something. They want it back because all that policy that changed that we talked about at the beginning.
Yeah.
Labour Party very busy driving this new manifesto around deposit returns, but also extended producer responsibility, the idea that the brands are paying for material to go around the system. Well, there's no point in them putting stuff on the market that's really hard to handle because they're going to end up being taxed or losing the money they put in the system. So for me, being able to talk to them early and go, do you know what, if we did this or we did that, or if you moved that layer or we changed the lid, we could guarantee much more of that material would flow through the system without any excessive change or cost. They're like, okay, we can work on that. And we've certainly done that with some of the big brands over the last few years.
Yeah, I mean, a very interesting is water bottles, because I've noticed that you can't take them off now. They're stuck on because to stop the lid flying off, which is a bit annoying, but actually I get it because you want the whole thing in one, don't you?
Now, I'm not going to claim any credit for that design innovation. Those lids would get lost in a traditional waste management, resource management, because they would fall through the conveyors and through the sorting plant. They're just too small. So keeping them attached is an absolute bonus because that material doesn't get lost.
A simple thing.
But from a user perspective, I'm forever trying to find the right angle to not throw the water. So I think it's a step in the right direction, but we're not at the end of that journey.
Let's talk about net zero and waste, because one of the things that is very important is all of this green building that Labour wants to do, all of this stuff, right? There's nothing that we do that doesn't come with an effect. We know this. Okay. But I suppose what we've got to be smart enough to do now is design from the very beginning, like you were talking there, so that there is circularity. So how much of that work is going on? And again, whose job is that? Because if someone's coming up with building a small modular reactor, right? Or then building an EV or whatever, they're looking for what performance, whatever. How much are they now going, what happens when it's end of life? What happens to that wind turbine blade when it's done 25 years? What can we take out of that car? Its battery's gone or its tire's gone. So again, coming back to that point, is this you as the waste industry? Is it them? And how do we get that? It's no point having a green revolution if we're just producing more crap that we're just hiding away.
So, I mean, I think there's a couple of really important questions in there. So let's start with whose responsibility is it? I think government has to set the framework that goes eco-design, for want of a better phrase, or design for multiple lives, or design for end of life.
End of life, yeah.
We'll take that. That's important that the right framework there. And at the moment, the Labour government is getting that legislation in place. The European Union is doing similar. Those systems should align, which means all of these new areas of innovation will require an end of life position.
Yeah.
And therefore either money going into a pot to help finance the end of life solution, or innovative partnerships like those with Suez, where we're looking at wind turbines at the moment, because the first batch of wind turbines in the UK
They're coming to the end of their life, aren't they? Yeah.
literally now, and we
Yeah.
have been taking wind turbines off sites around Scotland and starting to do initial processing to say, how does that work? What's the best practice? What can we do with that material? What's the end market going to be? Because if we can get that right over the next 18 months, then there's a long-term flow of material coming that we can then be certain of. The other question you raised there about EV and batteries in
Yes.
particular,
Yeah.
that's an earlier stage problem, i.e., we haven't got many vehicles that have got to end of life yet. But what we are realizing is, and this is why you've got some of these really big battery recycling plants jumping up both in Europe and both here in the UK, is to recognize that we don't know how big the problem is and we don't know how easy the solution is. But by working on it now, we've got 3 or 4 years to solve a problem that will be a massive issue if we don't have a solution for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And unlike what happened with packaging, which was we let packaging proliferate and evolve and materials change and niche this and niche that, we've recognised that with EV and the blades from the renewable plants and everything else that's coming, we've now learned that you need to innovate collaboratively in the value chain to have a solution ready to go that is both commercially viable and can operate at the kind of scale that these materials are going to require. That didn't happen with the packaging, and packaging's been playing catch up.
Is that because politicians have got more switched on? Is it because you as an industry have got more switched on, or, pressure from, or is it everything?
It's all of the above. I think consumers of all types are starting to go, I don't want to be the one with a load of EVs sitting outside with nothing to do, and then I've got the problem. I think we're seeing that my sector, my sector has always, historically, hump it and lump it would be a great phrase. You talk about bins, rubbish, trash, garbage, all those.
Scrap metal, guys.
But we're not. I mean, Suez is a resource management business. We handle lots of segregated material. We handle niche materials, and we put them back into secondary, tertiary use, reuse and repair. This is the future of our sector, is going material specific. And therefore, the circular economy, that loop that you talk about, isn't one loop. It's a cobalt loop. It's a copper loop. It's an organic loop. And actually, the job of businesses like mine is to innovate and evolve to be able to provide all of those loops so that very few materials end up requiring ultimate disposal or end-of-life treatment. And that's the goal of the sector, is to be not only net zero from a carbon perspective, we need to be, resource efficient, because we've got to consume less. Otherwise, you're going to have conflicts like the one in Ukraine or the one in the Congo or the one in the Amazon around resources that are in, very small niche locations that are underpinning the electric revolution wherever it might be. We need to understand that those materials can't be buried or burnt and lost from the economy.
Brutal question. You can't really have net zero without waste, can you?
I'm not even sure you can have net zero, if I'm being brutally honest.
Yeah.
I think if I can get 99% efficiency, I think everybody would be really happy with an economy that was thriving with very little leakage or loss.
The trouble is really interesting because, we've done loads of podcasts. We did a fantastic, very young lady who's working on skips, right? And she's invented this thing, which is a little kind of radar that tells you how full a skip is, so that you're not wasting a journey to pick up an empty skip or whatever.
Yes.
We've done stories about people, like you talked about earlier, mushrooms, and using that for packaging. The bit that I suppose is vital to all this, or is me, right? Because I'm gonna have my habits, and we're all gonna have different habits all around the world, right? It's very hard to change human habits. So the question is, if I go and put this phone at the end of its life, although I've kept it for a flipping long time, I'll tell you that much, but it goes in the end of its life, I just put it in my drawer, right? Don't worry about it. And then, I don't know, move house, goes to dump, whatever. That's my choice because I'm going, I don't want to. Or is it that you guys or government or whatever, you incentivize me, Apple incentivizes me to take this back, and then I get some money back or I do something? Because what I'm trying to get to is Where do we get that shift of behavior? Because
Yeah.
people will only really do things if they're A, convenient, or they're getting something out of it.
So you're absolutely right. We launched a manifesto today about reuse and repair, where we've asked government to help us normalise reuse and repair, something that
Yeah.
in the war, my mum's generation was absolutely the norm.
I grew up
And
with that. Absolutely. Take your radio down to the bloke and he fixes it.
And how do you do that? Well, you can't do it by making everything really, really expensive, because
No.
that's just counter to where we are. But what we can do is make access easier. So if every village had a repair cafe, that's just as easy as putting in your bin, almost.
Yeah,
If,
yeah,
if you've got
yeah,
a deposit on something with a lithium battery in it, because lithium not only is valuable but creates fires in the waste management system.
yeah.
Well, you might walk an extra 5 minutes to take that to a drop-off point to get your £2.50 back, or £3.50, or whatever it might be, because of the value. I think these little nudges or rewards, as you say, are going to be intrinsically important to shifting certain people's behaviour. Other people would do it because they're absolutely committed.
Yeah, I
The
get it.
next generation are absolutely buying into it. My son's 12. They're very tech savvy, but they're also very environmentally savvy, and you can see the way that they're buying and selling online platforms that I'd never heard of. They're already bought into this kind of, stuff goes round and round and round. So I think it's a set of different messages and different levers for different parts of society, but we need to build it to the norm. So the generation after my son doesn't have an option, because the norm is the norm, and we're all playing our role.
How do we do this? You're a global company, right? So you're
Yes.
all over the place. There are things that you'll have to do in the UK that you wouldn't do in other places, right? And that's no slight on what you do, but they're local rules and local laws, and there are loads of things that are allowed, like the weird chickens in America. But if you look at that, does that mean for companies like you go and go, right, we're going to do one set of processing for the whole world, or we have to adjust it, and then that throws in different questions about kind of, are there different rules for different places, and kind of are certain people getting cleaner places than others? Do you know what I mean?
Uh,
The divergence of value.
You do ask the tough questions, don't you?
I'm sorry, that's my
That's
job.
not a problem. And I'm always happy to answer a question like that, because I think it's really important that global companies lead from the
Yeah.
front. And I think, look, we will always be compliant with whatever the regulations are wherever we work. So that's the first thing. But I've got to be honest, when you look at what Suez has done globally, when it's invested in places like Indonesia or in Turkey, we've got operations on most continents these days. We're always looking at international best practice. I don't, the board, don't want to invest knowing or unknowing that system is going to be inefficient, or it's
Yeah,
going to
I get
be,
it.
or it's requiring child labour.
Yeah,
No,
all of
so
that
we
stuff.
we
Yeah.
want to invest in places where we can be certain that the material quality and the employment situation are absolutely aligned with Suez's goals and priorities and principles.
What about a future market? Will there be a future market, like we trade oil, crops, gold, whatever? Do you think there'll be like a waste market in the future that adds the value? So secondhand aluminium, lithium, things like that. Maybe there is already, I don't know. But,
There is.
is there that sort of stuff that you think would start to come into it? Secondhand polymers, who knows?
I, so a waste market, no, but materials markets, definitely. They already exist. And I think future trading of future commodities, absolutely going to be a big driver for rare or at-risk material streams that globally we need. And you can think about many of those that underpin the electrification, decarbonisation agenda. But I also think carbon is something that can be traded, and in the future the price of carbon is going to change, and that's going to be a really big driver, I think, for investment in new infrastructure, new technology, new R&D. So I think carbon markets, and I think if I was going to be really avant-garde, I'd say there's social value industries like mine can generate, because we provide community opportunities for training or reskilling or
Yeah,
employment.
yeah. I was going to talk about skills. Yeah,
and
yeah, yeah.
and that space where at the moment that's a nice to have. And if one of my municipal customers wants a little bit of that, they might value it, and therefore when they go to market we might be able to bid against that. But in reality, nobody really knows what the social value of anything is, and I think that the future for me in a sector that's all about quality material and therefore material handling is going to be about people and the value that we generate because of the communities that we operate within. And I think so trading around commodities, trading around carbon, trading around social value will all be very powerful drivers as we look to become more local, better neighbours, and more embedded in the small systems that we support in communities across the world.
There is always going to be a vociferous voice, a small voice, but vociferous voice, which just hates it all, right? They don't want any waste recycling factory near their house. They think that all companies like yours and everyone else, they're all evil and everyone's evil, right? There are parts of the world where, frankly, people live on waste, right? They live on the waste processing. They go around, collect the stuff. And there's obviously the elements that we can see with the Pacific garbage patch, things like that, that are very visceral, that affect us. We've got to be realistic about where we are and how, the amount we've screwed this place up so far over the last sort of 200 years. But are you hopeful that there's a way for us to kind of science the shit out of it, as people would say, that there's a way for us to try and undo a lot of the stuff we've done? And actually, if we start now, maybe we don't have, like you say, for your grandkids, that sort of legacy on them.
Yeah, well, I think you should rename your podcast because science the shit out of it should.
That would get name that would be better, wouldn't it?
That'll get my 12-year-old darling in, I tell you. I
rename it.
I used to be a consultant, and a lot of that was global consultancy. So I worked on tips and dump sites around the world. I helped repatriate, people that were picking from bins on streets to get them trained and get them, upskilled and get them into the workforce. So I've seen that, and it's terrible. And I think working in a big waste management company, resource management company like mine, actually is a way that you can change the livelihoods of thousands of people on locations across the world in a way that sometimes those government-funded UN agendas, they're great, but often they fail to deliver long-term change.
It's a business that can do it. Yeah, exactly. I mean, business can change it.
So I think where I am now, I feel much more confident about the future in that respect. I think realistically, I get plenty of complaints. People don't want a new site, and and of course they don't. But actually, when you go and take them to see a site, they realise that the anaerobic digester that's grown up in Surrey has less odour than the M25 and less emissions. And I think we had an EFW being built, an energy from waste plant being built in Suffolk that everybody was complaining about. But when you took some of the local community to go and see a sister facility somewhere else, they realised just how well designed and operated it is, and then they become an advocate for it. So I think everything's possible if we're willing to spend the time and effort to take people on a journey, because what's going to inspire my mum or my son is going to be different from somebody that lives near a motorway or near an AD plant.
Yeah,
and I think we have to recognise that change takes time. But I'm confident that, as somebody that's been in the sector, almost 30 years, we've gone from 90% landfill to 45% recycling and 45% energy recovery and heat offtake. I can see the next decade and in my years towards retirement, if you like, a system where we're more cyclical, we're more circular, there's more material streams with value. It won't be perfect, but I think it'll be a far better place than the industry that I came into, not just here in the UK, but globally, because global commodities and global livelihoods are on the news all the time. So, we have to play nicely and collaboratively as a value chain. And I think, the big brands are now understanding that they've got a role to play.
Yeah.
My industry understands it's got a role to play. Municipalities understand that, good waste resource management sits well alongside livelihoods. It sits well alongside, social value. Yes, I think you can see the dots joining far more effectively now than ever before, and that gives me hope for my grandkids having a nice place to live, work, and enjoy.
Yeah, brilliant. I love it. That is the best crap chat I've ever had.
My pleasure.
And I've talked a lot of crap in my life.
Well, it makes two of us.
Adam, best of luck with what you're doing. I think it's really good stuff. I'm sure on the Suez website, people can find some stuff that's going on. I think it's a very important topic that we probably don't look at enough. So thanks for joining me on this podcast.
My pleasure. Take care.
Tell me what you think, ladies and gents. Get in touch on social media. Drop us a line. Tell us what you think about the waste issues, how we deal with them, and what you think the solutions are. My thanks to Zoe for production this week. Keep subscribing. See you on the next Net Hero podcast.
You've just heard the Net Hero podcast from FutureNetZero.com. Join us as we help you find ways to cut your carbon footprint as we head towards net zero. Subscribe and follow us on social media. FutureNetZero.com. Better business, better planet.